It's time to stitch the inner borders on our Twilight Boulevard bench pillow. The borders start on page 25, and for this project, because it did not have background quilting, they hadn't started doing that yet, the borders, the inner border, which is this black fabric, as well as the patchwork border, did not have any quilting. You simply took your fabric and just sewed it like you would a quilt border. You just sewed it to the blocks. And the same thing with the patchwork border. You just made the patchwork. We're going to go over that in the next video. Then you just took those sewn together strips and sewed it to the quilt top. Because then they talk about, after sewing this together, they talk about quilting. It says that the quilting, the top is highly recommended. It keeps the shape, and the pillow form, will look better when it's quilted. So if you look at this picture, it's hard to tell because of course they used matching thread. There is just like a stipple design all around. I'm sure that this was custom quilted. And you can see that there's some quilting up on the borders, but this was done after the entire quilt top was put together, and it was done like you would do a regular traditional quilt. Now that we have background quilting designs, we will do all of our quilting before we put our quilt top together. So the directions called to cut these 1.5 inches. Again, sew them on, that's it, and your borders are on. When I do borders, I cut them a little bit larger, and now actually, if you're doing something newer with Kimberbell, they will have you normally for inner borders that will become 1 inch by the time that they're sewn. They have you cut them 2 inches and do the background quilting with the batting, and just like we've done the blocks, and then trim them down to 1.5 inch so that when they're sewn to the quilt top with the border on top and the blocks on the bottom, they will become 1 inch finished borders. Now I do my borders a little bit different. I've done borders many different ways, including how Kimberbell now does their borders, and I have found a different way that works for me. So what I do is I do cut my fabric larger, just like the directions in current. I cut about 2 inches. Some reason these were cut 2 1/4. I'm not really sure why. Again, this was prepped a long time ago, but I do cut it larger. So if the border is to finish at 1.5 per Kimberbell, I usually cut it at 2. And that's just to start. Then I will go ahead and put my interfacing on the back, just like I normally do. And then I will trim to the final size. The final trim size is 1.5 inches. And that's going to be before I quilt. Now again, Kimberbell has you quilt with the 2 inch wide, then trim it down after the background quilting. I find that it works better to trim this first. And the only reason I don't just automatically trim this to 1.5 to start, because that would save me, fabric and time. You can see that this project, granted, I prepped it a couple years ago, but it's fraying, and it's not a nice, crisp, clean edge that I need for the way that I do the borders. So after having the interfacing on, I am now going to trim these to 1.5 inches. That way, when I stitch the placement for my batting and stitch the placement for my fabric, I will have the fabric placement exactly the size that I need to place my 1.5 inch border fabric. Now this is about the only time that I run the fabric placement, because again, when we do blocks, our fabric is cut much larger and we just don't really need that placement line. But because I am trimming these down exactly to the finished size, so once I get done quilting, they're already ready to be sewn on. I don't have to trim. I need the fabric placement so that I can place my strip of fabric as even as I can, because when I, of course, quilt this long piece, I'm going to have multiple hoopings to get this whole strip quilted, and the placement line will help me make sure that I'm as straight as can be. So my first step is to take these wider borders, now that I'm ready to stitch. They have interfacing on the back, and I am going to trim them exactly to 1.5 inches. I'll have nice, crisp, clean edges that aren't fraying. And then I'm going to show you the inner border quilting that I picked. Again, this doesn't have quilting, it wasn't invented yet. And I picked it just from some quilting that I had already purchased. All right, so I'm going to get these cut down and we'll start these borders. So on one side, I cut just a little tiny amount to clean that edge, straighten it, and have a good guide to cut my final size. So this is my cut edge, and I've lined it up with 1.5 inches, and I have it lined up down the side and then one on the bottom to make sure I'm as straight as can be. And you can see how much I'm going to cut off. Normally it wouldn't be this much. Again, I'm not sure why these were cut to 2.25. I normally cut it at 2, so I have about 1/2 inch to work with. So I have my 1.5 inch. I will double check that. And I will cut. So now I have my inner border cut to the exact size that I need. And I have nice, crisp, clean edges. So I'm going to set this aside and do the same thing with the other one. For the batting for borders, I always cut my batting to size. And so for these inner borders, the batting will have a finished size of 1 inch. So I have just pulled some scraps that I've used and were in my scrap container, and I'm going to use these first. What I do when I'm starting a new strip, let's say if I didn't have any scraps, I take my large package of Warm and Natural that I get. I usually get either a full or a queen size, and then cut from there. And I cut similar to how I cut my muslin for stabilizer. I cut with the fabric, which means I have a super long strip. This is one that I used for a project. It's just one long strip. Now, if I were to cut my 1 inch off of this strip, I would have plenty to do my whole entire inner border without having to piece anything together. However, that's how I ended up with some scraps, is because I didn't have any 1 inch scraps, and so I cut the width of fabric, and now I have all these, pretty long pieces, some not quite so long. So if I were just to cut this, yes, it would definitely be not necessarily faster and easier, but it would be one piece. But then I would just end up with more scraps. So I am not going to use this. I am going to use these two pieces. I have two that are fairly long, and then I have a couple that are, shorter, and I'll show you how I piece them together. There's nothing special, or you don't have to sew them together. You just butt them together when I'm putting them on the stabilizer. And if these together don't equal the length that I need for my black strip for my border, I just pulled another longish piece of batting for my scraps, and I will just cut 1 inch pieces and see if that will get me to the size that I need. All right, so let's go ahead and start with our placement lines for the border. So I'm ready to start quilting, and I am going to go to the background quilting. I am looking for this small border, and I will list the border that I'm using. Again, I think this was just a design I purchased on its own. I'm not sure that it came in a bundle. It just says Tricks and Treats, and it has some candy. So I am going to set. I'm going to go ahead and change my hoop size. I'm going to go back to my 9x14. I want to hoop as long of a length as I can so that I have less hoopings. However, if you only have a smaller hoop, you can do the same thing. You would, of course, pick a design that fits your hoop, and then you would just have more hoopings. All right, I'll hit OK. I'm going to bump this back up. And I have one of those, and I am just going to move it over because I need two. I have two designs, and I want to move them over to save on stabilizer. I'll show you a little bit more about that. So now for me, if I go to edit, this little box with the dotted box is a copy. So I'm going to make a copy, and it puts it right on top. So if I go to move, that one is automatically selected because I just brought it in, and I'm just going to bump it to the left. Now I don't need these very far apart because my fabric, again, is cut exactly to the width of this border. And that will help me save over here for a smaller, so all of this can be put in a smaller hoop at some point. All right, so I have them pretty close together, and that looks good, so I can select OK. Now if I were to stitch these, if I go to embroidery and to my minus plus needle and stitch these, you can see there's two sets of colors, two blocks of colors, and that would just stitch out one entire border start to finish, and then move on to the second one. And that's fine to do. However, I can color group on my machine. That way I can do the placement lines at the same time. I can place both of my pieces of batting. I can tack both of my fabrics down and then run the background quilting at the same time. Now I could do this in software, but I'm just doing it at my machine. So what I need to do is go back to layout and color group, which for me on my machine, I'm on a Stellaire 1. I've upgraded to the 2. I have these 3 little spools. If I select that, can't see on this screen for my machine, but if I go back to the minus plus needle, now you'll see there's just one set of colors, and so it will do the placements together, the tack downs, the placement. It'll do everything for both instead of just one at a time. For my borders, I am going to use no-show mesh. I have one piece just cut to the size of my hoop, and that's mostly because my border fills up the hoop top to bottom. Again, I have all of this to the left. My borders are going to be over here, and they're only 1.5 inches, so 3 inches. This will be enough for me to save for my 4x4 or even a smaller hoop that I will just put in my scraps. So that's why I moved them over instead of just leaving them in the middle and just wasting. I'll at least have this available for something else in a smaller hoop. All right, so let's go ahead and stitch out the placement line for the batting. Now the next step is going to be the tack down of the batting. I cut my batting to size all the time for borders, and so I need to skip this tack down. I'll use my down arrow, and even though I'm color grouped, and if I were to stitch the step, my machine would not stop. If I skip steps, it treats them as individual steps, so I need to skip that one as well. And now I'm going to run the fabric placement, but I have not placed my batting yet. I'm going to do that in just a minute. Now that I have both of the placement lines, I'm ready to place my batting and my fabric. I chose the light purple thread from the threads that I've been stitching this quilt with, and I'm hoping that it looks good on that black and white polka dot. I want to see the quilting. I'm not sure with the polka dots if it's going to be all that legible, but I want it to have a more noticeable quilting. Now, when I place my batting and fabric, I need to do it the same way every single time. I'm again going to have multiple hoopings to quilt that big long strip. So this is the left side of my hoop. This is how my hoop goes into my machine. For me, I always turn my hoop to the left so that the top of my hoop is to my left, the bottom is to my right. I will do that every single time I come place my fabric. That's important because if I were to do it one hooping with the top this way and then do the next hooping with the bottom of the hoop this way, my quilting would be upside down. It would not all be the same orientation. So no matter how you do it, always do it the same way. Now for the batting, I am going to lightly spray, and actually this short piece fits this perfect, even with a little bit of hangover, so I'm going to use that first. So I am going to lightly spray with my Ganol KK100 and place both strips of batting into this middle placement line. Now for my fabric, I'm going to do the same thing. I will put a little extra, I don't know, maybe a quarter of an inch or half an inch to the left past this placement line, and then I will use the fabric placement to place my fabric. And that's, you can see now why it's so beneficial to cut the fabric the exact size. But again, I do it right when I'm ready to quilt. You can see I just cut that, and I've got a tiny bit of frame, but I want the nice crisp edges. So I'm going to spray. I usually use this. Sometimes I'll put this down, so I know I need to spray this amount, so I will just put my fabric, and I know that I will just spray to about right here. Then that works for the first pieces because they're not, you know, attached. But I end up doing it a little bit different as I go along, and I'll show that in future hoopings. So now, again, I'm going to place this a little bit past. And now I'm going to just place my fabric right along that line. So if you look, the edge of my fabric is right along, essentially this one, the outside placement. And that's how I'm able to get as straight as I can. So now you can see how both are hooped. They're exactly where they need to be. I've taped them. This is the top of my hoop, and I have the extra piece down towards the bottom of my hoop. And if I had one long strip of batting, or if I had used one of these longer ones, you would also see batting, but mine happened to be pretty close to the exact size. All right, so let's take this to the machine. The next step is a tack down of the fabric, and that for borders is a little bit different than it is for blocks. For borders, you might be able to see my needle is moved in and not right on the edge. It's not the same as the fabric placement. On blocks, the fabric placement and fabric tack down run exactly the same size. They're exactly the same. This will run towards the inside, and that's why I can cut my fabric exactly to size, because the tack down jumps in a little bit. All right, let's stitch this and see how that purple looks. This is so cute, and I really am happy with the light color thread. I think it really was a great alternative to just black or white. I think it gives a great little pop of color. I love it. Now, the only thing I would say about this actual quilting is I can read the word treats really easily. To me, even just looking at the file on the screen, tricks is not easy to read with the C right next to the K. And I know that's, you know, how the font was made, or this background quilting is made. It makes it look like an O, and that's, for me, even though I know it says tricks, that's not easily legible for me. But in the scheme of things, with this in the border, I love it. I love the purple. All right, so let me show you how easy it is to rehoop. So I've taken this out of my hoop. I've rehooped with my second piece. You might be able to hear it. I am just running those placement lines again. Now this is why I moved my borders over, because I have enough for a smaller hoop. So the first thing I'm going to do is just loosely trim. I'm not going to trim right next to the fabric. I'm going to do that when I get ready to stitch these on. Again, I feel like if I have a little bit extra, maybe the fabric edges won't get as frayed because they're not getting touched. Anyways, so I have this long piece that is a great size that I wouldn't have had if I would have kept those in the middle. I would have not had extra. So I'm just going to put that in my scraps. Now I'm going to do the same thing with cutting these apart. I'm just going to loosely trim these. I'll take care of all of that later. Not sure why I'm using utility scissors. They're not very sharp. Now you could, you know, use a rotary cutter, but you don't need it for this. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to set that aside and show you the only place on here that I am going to cut nice and straight. Let me go start my machine. So I went to my machine and I skipped the batting, tacked down, and now I'm running the fabric placement. Now for the end that is between what we just quilted and the unquilted, that is an end that I need to cut nice and straight. Now again, normally I would have a longer strip of batting and I would just fold that back and get that out of the way. And you can see that there's just that placement line. So what I'm going to do is just above it, I mean the stitching goes right to the edge, so you can't really cut on that, and you don't need to, but you want it nice and straight. So I'll just do, I don't know, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. Just so it's a nice, you know, clean, straight edge. I'll do that on this one. This one has even less batting, but that worked out perfect because I used a scrap that I probably wouldn't use otherwise because it's only 1 inch. All right, so again, I just cut that nice and straight. It's a little bit past that. All right, let me get the hoop and I'll show you how easy it is to hoop. Since I don't have any batting long enough to add to the second hooping, I'm going to set these aside. If I had batting, and I'll show you this on the third hooping, I would immediately start with this. But again, I used up those smaller pieces. So I'm going to grab one of these longer pieces, and now you'll see on this one, we'll have, for the third hooping, we'll have a bunch already attached. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to spray and attach the batting to those center marks. Now, since my batting is so little and I placed my new piece right up to the edge, I'm going to go ahead and trim that also right next to where I did the stabilizer, making sure that I do not cut the fabric. I could cut it on this side if I want. So now I have just the stabilizer and my fabric, and I'm going to take and fold that back, making sure that my quilted piece that I just quilted is towards the top of my hoop. Remember, the top of my hoop, the way I'm hooping, will always go to my left. That's super important. And then I will just take this fold and line it up right along this new placement line. And it's harder to see because my batting, again, is exactly the size, but I want my batting, of course, to line up with the center. And then when I place that down, my fabric should line up with the outer. Now I'm going to go ahead and spray in here. This is what I do different from here on out. Instead of taking this over here and spraying it, I don't want to get anything on what I just quilted. So what I'll do is I'll usually try to cover my hoop, and then I will just come, again, it's very light, and I will just spray where I'm going to place. And just holding this, I'll flip this, and now line up again with that outside placement line. And again, you can see I'm already fraying a little bit, and that's why I do not cut my borders to size until I'm getting ready to stitch them. All right, so I will do the same thing with this one. Now this one had that little bit longer piece. So because it's so little, I'm just going to cut it off. Normally when I have a piece that is a little bit longer, I don't cut it off and waste it. I would have placed this first and then butted this piece up, and I'm going to show you that on the next hooping. But because this is so small, I'm just going to cut it off so you can see different ways, because you can just cut your batting exactly to each size hooping. You don't need to leave it longer. If you wanted to cut this off down here and then just put one piece each time, you could do that, and you would do it the way that I'm doing it. So you would have one piece exactly the right size, fold it back, make sure your quilted piece is towards the top of your hoop or however you hooped it, line it up. I've got threads and batting everywhere. I'm going to spray, trying to just cover my hoop. And then I will again line this up. Without stretching or pulling, I just kind of pat in place and make sure that is set. Now I'll take my tape, I always save it, and I'm starting right here where my quilting is, so I am going to tape just a little bit back. On this side, I usually just fold back to see where my placement line ends, and then I will tape so I don't run over that tape. All right, so now this looks exactly the same, other than I have my original or my first hooping up at the top, and I still have my piece that I'm going to be doing next down towards the bottom. But let's go see how to line these up to make sure we're even. So I'm ready to do the tack down, and I want to make sure that I'm about as even as I can get. Now I have my little light on. It's hard to see sometimes because this fabric goes up and over the hoop to see if it's in the exact right spot, and I actually think my light is a little off, so I'm going to have to get that looked at sometime. But I can always check. I want to see how close I am to this tack down that's on the previous stitch. So if I put my needle down, I can see that I'm just a hair, you might be able to see just, a tiny bit to the right. So if I lift my needle up, now what I could do, It was so minimal, but I could kind of pull and see if I can, you know, hold it. But it's so tiny that I'm not going to worry about it. Now, if I was way, you know, up here, then I would probably take this off and readjust. That I'm going to call good. So I am going to tack down. Now, when it gets finished stitching this side, then I'm going to stop my machine manually because it will start automatically on this side and do the same thing. Kind of line up and see if I'm, you know, pretty close. That's what I'm aiming for. So these lined up pretty good. Again, just a hair off. This one is a little bit more, but I'm going to call that good. All right, so now let's do the quilting. So the second hooping is done. You can see it looks great. It's really hard to tell where one starts and one stops. That's what's so great about Kimberbell quilting, especially on their borders. All right, so we have one more hooping. I've already, of course, cut these apart just loosely. I did trim both edges nice and clean between the two that I've quilted, and now at the end, and now you can see I have both batting and fabric at the end. I've got my placement lines, so I'm going to place these exactly the same, other than I now have my batting attached. And so what I will do is fold them back again. I've got it lined up, and now I'm going to just spray this because I don't want to spray it. I guess I could, you know, put this out, but I usually by this time just spray on my hoop. I spray lightly, and so I try to just cover the edge, but I spray lightly that I try not to get, you know, anything on the edges. Now again, my top of my hoop is to my left. That's how I've been hooping. So I'm going to just spray both of these. Fold this back, place it along that placement line on the end, and now I have batting to line up to the inside, and I'll just press that, and then just flip the batting over. Without stretching it, I will just press it into place. Now this one piece does cover, so I don't have to use any more. And for the next piece, oops, I forgot to cut this piece off. I will do the same thing. And that fits. Now, for the sake of showing another way to hoop or another way to add batting, if for some reason, let's say my strip ended anywhere and it didn't go to the end, I would simply take my next piece and butt it up. So let's say this piece of batting ended right here. I don't have to sew these together. I don't have to, do anything. I don't have to overlap them. I would simply take my next piece, butt it right up against, and continue. That's how you would put two pieces together. Mine happened to reach, and my other pieces that I used at the beginning were exactly the same size as I needed. So I didn't have to butt up, but I usually do that, especially if I'm using pieces and not starting a big long strip. All right, so now from here, it's just the same. I will spray. And then just take my fabric and line it up. Now I didn't put stabilizer all the way to the end. I think I just used a scrap. I kind of Frankensteined this together. You can see maybe on here. You can see that I had just the same thing with batting. I try to use scraps when I have them. And so I don't believe I need this last 2 inches. If I do, I'm okay with it a little bit. But you can see this fabric goes right to the end, but I will cut some of this off. I only need about, I think it's 38.5 inches. I think my strip's about 40, 41. So some of this is going to get cut off. So I didn't worry about going all the way to the end. And see how that works. All right, so I will tape these again. And we will go do the same thing. I'm going to go make sure that I'm, pretty lined up. You can see that, again, it was hard to tell where one stopped and one started. Only really because you know where the stabilizer starts and stops. All right, so let's go do our last hooping. Now I also want to know whether you're doing borders or you're just using a strip of muslin like I did for my blocks. If you have anything coming off the back of your hoop, make sure it doesn't get caught underneath and get stitched down. With no-show mesh, you can see if, for example, if this border would have been tucked under. On muslin, it's sometimes hard to see because muslin, of course, is more opaque. So just make sure that if you have anything coming off the back, that it is going off to the back. All right, so with the tack down, it looks like I'm about right. If I drop my needle, I'm about right where I need to be. So I'll go ahead and tack this side down. I am going to stop my machine and just kind of double check to make sure I'm close, and then we will finish this last hooping. So I have my border strip done. It looks so good. This end piece that was a little bit long, I'm just going to cut off. And let's take a look. Now, if you just look at these, it's hard to tell where, again, one starts and one stops. And sometimes the only way I know is because I know, or I can see where the stabilizer, starts again. It looks so good. I love it. All right. I am going to leave these just trimmed like this until I'm ready to sew these on. Again, if I trim it right now, there's just more chance of it fraying. And so I leave it like this until I get my outer borders done, sew my top together, and I'm ready to sew these on. So our inner borders are done.